everybody, welcome to O'Neill chapter 8 about developed democracies. And so, if you remember, in the last lecture we were talking about democracies in general, and today we're talking specifically about democracies that are developed, and so generally democracies that have reached a certain level of economic proficiency. And so the big question today is, what are the key markers of a developed democracy? How do values factor into this context? What are the values of a developed or advanced democracy? So just to review, when we're talking about democracy, the way you measure that is by looking at Freedom House or at Polity 4. You measure inequality by the Gini coefficient. You measure wealth by GDP or purchasing power parity, and you measure human development by the HDI indicator. And so all of these have to do with whether a country is considered developed or not. And so they tend to have high scores on democracy, relatively low scores on inequality, high scores on wealth, and high scores on human development. So developed democracies are institutionalized, and they have high levels of economic development and prosperity, and they used to be called the First World. And so we used to talk about the First World being developed democracies, the Second World being communism, and then the Third World being sort of everything else, what we now call sort of the developing world. And so by institutionalized, we mean democracies that consistently score very highly on Freedom House and Polity 4. So they consistently are 9s or 10s on Polity House, consistently are 1s or 2s on Freedom House. There tends not to be any sort of competition. And so democracy tends to be the only game in town. There doesn't tend to be major threats to civil liberties, major threats to elections, things like that. They also have a high level of economic development and prosperity, and this tends to be widely distributed across the population. And so if you look at this chart here, developed democracies are found all over the world. And some democracies have a very high GDP per capita. And so if you look at Norway, their GDP per capita is extremely high. It's about $65,000 US a year. The United States, Germany, Australia all have very high GDPs. And then you have Israel and South Korea at the bottom, which have much lower GDPs, but are also considered developed democracies. So some of the shared characteristics of developed democracies include economics, and so they almost all have capitalist economic systems that are either liberal, like the United States and the United Kingdom, social democratic, like most of the European countries, or mercantilist. So Japan in the 1980s was a developed democracy with a mercantilist economy. There tends to be a domination of the service sector, and this is something we'll talk about more in a couple of weeks, but in terms of the type of industry that dominates, it tends not to be raw materials. It tends to be refined things like the service sectors. They have high HDI rankings, and so there tends to be some sort of advanced level of gender parity, although, as we know, we're still working on that in the United States and other countries. There tends to be high levels of life expectancy. There tends to be high levels of income and low levels of inequality. And there tends to be a focus on freedom and equality as well. So in terms of the way that we define developed democracies, what you can see here is the percentage of GDP contributed by agriculture, and so by farming, by industry, so by making stuff, and then by services. And so in the United States, almost none of our GDP comes from farming. Very little, 20% comes from industry, and then 80% comes from services. In Germany, it's almost the same, and so almost nothing comes from farming. 25% or so of their economy comes from industry, and about 75% comes from services. Poland, which is probably the most developed of the former countries of the former Soviet bloc, they have, about 5 or 10, maybe 7% of their economy comes from agriculture. A higher number comes from industry. So you have 35%, and then you have about 65% coming from service. So this is what you'll see in countries that are sort of rapidly developing, but maybe not quite as advanced economies as the United States and Germany. In Saudi Arabia, you have 60% of their economy coming from industry. And so if you know things about Saudi Arabia, you can assume that that industry is oil, right? Also, obviously, Saudi Arabia is not a democracy. And one reason that many people hypothesize that it's not a democracy, even though it's the longest running monarchy in the world, is the fact that continues to use hereditary monarchies, is the fact that they are so reliant on their oil sector that they can capture that part of the economy and not redistribute it to the middle class. In China, which is also not a democracy and is rapidly developing, and it has the largest economy in the world at this point, you see that industry and services are almost tied. In India, you see that there's a very high level of agriculture, so there's a very high level of people who are rural poor that rely on agriculture, and then a high level of industry, and then a lower level of service. And then Nigeria, you have about even, really. So you have about 32% for agriculture, about 45% or so for industry, and then only about 22%, 25% for services. So these three countries over here, the United States, Germany, and I would include Poland in it, developed democracies, you see that there is a very low level of agriculture and a very high level of the service economy. So in terms of continuing to look at what a developed democracy has, the first thing they have is participation and competition. And so you'll remember these from our discussion of how you define democracy. Robert Dahl says you need participation and competition. And so developed democracies have high levels of participation, and so they have referenda, they have initiatives, they have advanced voting rules that make sure that voting is equal. They have competition, and so this includes campaign funding rules. They have different executive systems that make sure that there's some sort of competition among the executives. And they also have liberties and rights, and so they make sure that freedoms are protected, although these vary across the different liberal democracies. They protect rights, and the courts have various powers as well. So one of the interesting things about developed democracies is that as countries get more developed, you see less of a focus on sovereignty. And so you remember from some of the first lectures in the class, we talked about state sovereignty being paramount. That's what the Treaty of Westphalia was about, was focusing on states being able to protect what was in their borders. And one of the things that you see as countries become more developed is that there's less of a focus on sovereignty. And so there's two reasons why that might be true. The first is international integration. And so if you, as countries give greater power to international organization, it reduces the need for states to be able to provide for everything on their own. And so there's some sort of efficiency in that. And the greatest example of this is the constantly evolving experiment of the European Union. And so countries gave up sovereignty in exchange for existing in the European Union as part of one common market. Most of the countries engage in one currency, and so this has, economic benefits and it has cultural benefits. They provide for common security together, and so what this means is that states provide for fewer things for their citizens, and they give more powers over to these international organizations. The other thing you see is devolution. And devolution is giving greater power at the local and the regional level. And this reduces both state capacity and state autonomy. And so we've talked a little bit before about how you have in a lot of these developed democracies these separatist movements. And so you have the Quebec separatist movement in Canada, you have the Scottish separatist movement in the United Kingdom, and then you have this greater push for devolution of powers on the state level in the United States as well. And you can imagine how this decreases state capacity because you let states provide various things and make various decisions. And so in the United States right now, we're having a fairly intense debate over state capacity in terms of health insurance, right? In terms of whether or not the federal government should be the main actor on health insurance like it is in most of the rest of the world, or whether or not states should have a bigger hand in that. And it also reduces autonomy because you allow states to have veto power over more and more things. And so so you see this pressure on sovereignty coming both from the outside, coming from these like supranational organizations that that sort of connect you with the global community, but also coming very locally. You see pressure on the state to sort of devolve these powers to the state. And so this is a map of European Union membership before Brexit happened. And so what you can see is that, it stretches from Portugal to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, to Poland, to Romania, Bulgaria. And so all of these countries are part of the European Union. Norway is not an official member. Switzerland is not an official member. Iceland is not an official member, although they're sort of interested parties in it. And obviously, there's an enormous debate about Brexit right now with the United Kingdom. But the rest of these countries are part of the European Union. And so that has an enormous impact on things like markets and things like trading, and also things like regulations as common rules are adapted for the market. The other thing you see is that there's a sense of emerging identities and values. And so as states become more developed, similar norms, values, and identities emerge. This is sometimes called cosmopolitanism, and it changes citizens' views towards the states. And so people are debating what the impact is of this type of globalization on traditional material and post-material values, and on multiculturalism or local identities. But I think that it's clear, at least in some regards, that people who live in sort of this internationalized community do share sort of these norms that focus and emphasize multiculturalism, that emphasize free societies and open borders where you can move freely, that emphasize the more secular liberal values of education and things like that. And you see that as countries become more developed, they do move towards their populations adopting these types of values. And so in terms of what these values look like, they value rationality, and so modern values put emphasis on rationality and science, on individualism and autonomy, and on progress and material attainment. There's an emphasis on the quality of life in terms of environment and social justice. And there tends to be skepticism sometimes regarding authority and a hierarchy, as well as some skepticism regarding science and technological development. And so you see that there's a tension here between the modernist values of rationality and science, and then this skepticism of science and technological development. And so I think the book is making the argument that as we move towards this postmodern, postmaterial, cosmopolitanist moment, you see this focus moving away from individualism and autonomy towards this more globalist idea that questions the rigid hierarchies. So this is back to the chart that we've looked at a bunch of different times by Engelhardt, the World Value Survey. And so what they're arguing is that different societies have these different values, but you have the secular rational values up here, right? And you have self-expression values here. And those all concentrate sort of in this Protestant Europe area, and to a certain extent in this English-speaking area. And that's where you see this emergence of this postmodern new identity. Another part of that has to do with the percentage of immigrants as your national population. And so this has a huge impact on the way that societies structure themselves and the way that societies deal with resource distribution and things like that. And so part of what you see as this as developed democracies move towards this postmodern moment is a focus on open borders, a focus on thinking about immigration as good and immigration as a natural thing that happens. So 14% of the U.S. population are immigrants, 11% of Germany's population, although this has increased quite a bit since the refugee crisis happened. 20% of Canada's, so Canada has one of the most open policies towards immigration in the world. Almost 30% of Australia's population, about 12.5% of the UK's population, and only 2% of Japan's population, which is going to get Japan into trouble in terms of their population. And so one of the things that immigration does, which is why Japan's going to get in trouble, is it provides a tax base in countries that have declining populations. And so Japan, Germany have populations that are shrinking in size, and so more people are dying than babies are being born. And so immigrants obviously provide this new source of taxes and labor, they revitalize the economy. And so countries that have higher percentage of immigration tend to have a more stable basis to provide their social welfare system than countries with these very low levels of immigration. So the second part of the chapter that I want to talk about has to do with institutions and political institutions. And so what are the rules of the games in these developed democracies? And so this is important because it allows us to look at the comparative benefits of how the executive and legislature relate to each other and how votes are counted in different executive and legislative systems. And so these are the two types of systems. You have parliamentary systems and you have presidential systems. So we obviously have a presidential system. And so in a presidential system, we have a president as the executive branch, and we fuse together the idea of the head of state and the head of government. And what that means is that we have in one person the leader that represents us internationally, and so the person who deals with other countries, negotiates treaties, fosters and maintains alliances, things like that, as well as the head of government, who makes decisions, who has a legislative agenda domestically, and things like that. And so our president is head of state and government. In other systems, you have that sort of flipped, and so you have those two in different in different roles. And so what you can see here in terms of how the executive is chosen is that in parliamentary systems you have indirect elections. So voters elect the parliament then chooses the government. They choose their prime minister and they choose the cabinet. And so nobody in England, nobody in the United Kingdom voted for Theresa May. Theresa May is prime minister because she was chosen by her party to be the head of government. And so when they just had the snap elections in June, what that did was it took away the absolute majority from her party. So they're currently in the process of negotiating negotiating basically a new coalition. And so the idea is that you have to have some sort of governing majority of multiple parties that has the absolute number of seats in Congress or in Parliament, and they choose who the prime minister is going to be. So they choose who the leader is going to be. And so the other thing about parliamentary systems is they tend to be in a fluid election cycle. And so you hear a lot about governments dissolving. And this is not, in the United States, that would be a crisis. When this happens in Europe, it's not, or in most democracies, that's not a big deal. And so parliaments will dissolve themselves if they feel like they can't make decisions. They can have a vote of no confidence. The prime minister can call a new election, or time's up. And so there are lots of different ways that parliaments dissolve themselves, but it happens on a much more fluid schedule and a much more often regular basis than it does in the United States. On the other hand, in presidential systems, and there are only a handful of pure presidential systems besides the United States. So you have some in Latin America, you have some in Africa. France has mostly a presidential system, although they do certain things differently. But here, voters elect both the parliament or the legislature, and they also separately vote for the executive. And so in the United States, when you go to the polls, you select your member of Congress, you select your senator, and then you also vote for who you want to be the executive. And so here you have a fused system where people vote for their representation, and then you have the head of party. And so there's some pluses and minuses to this. And so one of the questions is, who is the primary initiator of legislation? So in parliamentary systems, it's the prime minister. In presidential systems, it's the legislature. And so the president tends not to introduce specific pieces of legislation to Congress. And so they will often try to control the legislative agenda or mold the legislative agenda, but they're not in charge of writing bills. Congress is the one that does that. And so in parliamentary systems, you have this fusion of legislative and executive. The parliament and judiciary might be weaker branches, and the prime minister can be very easily replaced between elections. In the presidential system, you have a separation of powers, you have co-equal branches, and it's very difficult to replace the executive between elections. And so, you know, in the United States, in order to replace an executive, it's enormously difficult if you're not having an election. And so you have to have the House vote for impeachment, and then after that, it goes to the Senate, and the Senate votes for removal. And so that's an enormously difficult process that, and impeachment's only happened a handful of times in our history. On the other hand, it's very easy to replace the executive in parliamentary systems because the prime minister is not thought of as having like a direct relationship with the people, but instead is the representative of the party that's in charge. So the second big question that's related is, how do you count votes? And so there are two different systems. The first is called a first past the post system, FPTP, which is also winner take all. And the second is proportional representation. So in the United States, we use first past the post systems. The United Kingdom uses a first past the post system. Most other countries, particularly countries that have deep political or religious divisions, use proportional representation systems of some kind. So let me give you a hypothetical example. Let's say you have four parties that are running: the Republicans, the Democrats, the Rent is Too Damn High Party, which is my favorite party that's ever come out of New York City, and the Green Party. And you have 10 districts that are going to be sending members to Congress. So in each of the districts, 45% of the population votes Republican, 40% of the population votes Democrat, and then 7.5% of the population votes for the Rent is Too Damn High, and 7.5% of the population votes for the Green Party. So, in a first past the post system, 100% of these seats, all 10 seats, would go to Republicans, right? The Republicans win each of these seats, so 100% of these seats would go to them. There would be 0 Democrats, 0 Rent is Too Damn High, and 0 Greens. And so on the one hand, this seems fair. Like, they win the most number of votes, they should be able to represent them. On the other hand, what you can see is that they're only representing 45% of the population. And so you have 55% of the population that has no representation in Congress. And so 55% of the population, a majority of the population, has no representation. And so what other countries do is they use a proportional representation system. And so what they would do is they would give 45% of the seats in Congress would go to Republicans, 40% of the seats in Congress would go to Democrats, 5% of the seats in Congress would go to the Rent is Too Damn High, and then 7.5% of the seats in Congress would go to the Greens. And so it would look something like this. And so either 4 or 5 seats would go to Republicans, either 4 or 3 seats would go to Democrats, 1 would go to Rent is Too Damn High, and 1 would go to the Greens. And so what you can see here is that you have much more equal representation when you use a proportional representation system. And so instead of having this winner take all that leaves large percentages of your population disenfranchised, instead you distribute the seats across these different parties. And there are lots of strategic advantages to doing that. And so if you look at the percentage of voters, as we said, 55% of voters are disenfranchised, have no representation in Congress. If you use first past the post, you have 0% of voters are disenfranchised if you use proportional representation, because everybody has at least one voice in Congress, one representative. So I like this video that further demonstrates why proportional representation is often considered a better system.
Welcome to The Problem with First Past the Post Voting Explained by me, CGP Grey. The royal family has a problem, but this isn't just any royal family. These are the lions, rulers of the jungle since time immemorial. There are protests over the monarchy's absolute power, and the citizens of the animal kingdom want a say in how they are governed. Bending to the pressure, Lion has abdicated his crown, and King is to be in elected office. To ensure a smooth transition, and because she is craftier than her husband, the Queen Lioness is remaining on the throne with the power to set the rules for all elections in her kingdom. She has declared that all citizens get one and only one vote, and that the candidate with the most votes wins the crown. This method of voting is most often called first past the post, awkwardly abbreviated as FPTP, or winner take all. The system is simple, fair, and logical, right? Actually, no. It's a terrible, terrible idea. Why? Well, to see the problems with first past the post, let's watch the first election unfold in the animal kingdom. It's an exciting time for the burgeoning democracy, and 7 hopeful candidates come forward to run and represent their parties. They put on their best campaigns, citizens head out to the polls, and the votes are counted. The results come in as follows. Turtle gets 9% of the vote, monkey gets 18, gorilla gets 19, owl gets 13, leopard gets 20, tiger gets 15, and snake gets 6. Under the rules of first past the post, leopard is crowned the winner, and she gets to rule for the length of her term. But take another look at the results, and you'll see the first problem with this system: minority rule. The vast majority of citizens, 80%, wanted someone else as king, but leopard still won. There were only 7 candidates in this race, but if you imagine if there had been 20, she might have only gotten 5% of the vote, but still been elected. This problem of minority rule is only the beginning. The second problem with first past the post is that, given enough time, it results in an inevitable, unavoidable two-party system. Why? To see, let's watch what happens over several election cycles. Leopard has had her term in office, and it's again election time in the young democracy. Only now, all the citizens of Animal Kingdom remember the results from last time. This information changes how they'll behave, particularly snake and turtle voters, who must face the reality that they backed unappealing extremist candidates who don't have a chance of winning. Turtle voters, who were unhappy under leopard rule, decide to back the candidate who has the best chance of winning, gorilla. Now, snake voters want to vote for tiger, who is the candidate they have the most in common with, but they're afraid to because leopard is running a negative campaign against her competitors. Snake voters, not liking the idea of gorilla rule, vote strategically for leopard. The final result looks like this, with leopard getting 26% of the vote and gorilla getting 28%, making him the new king. Snake and turtle, seeing their dismal results and knowing the cost of their campaigns, decide to drop out of future races. What started out as a 7-party system is now down to 5. Fast forward to the next election. Only 5 candidates run, and again the voters remember what happened last time. In this election, it's owl voters who recognize that their candidate cannot win. They are centrist voters and less ideological than the rest of the animal kingdom. As such, they don't really like gorilla or leopard. Both gorilla and leopard know this, so they each run negative campaigns to capitalize on the fears of the centrists. Owl voters split their vote and are mostly voting against the candidate they dislike rather than supporting the candidate they do like. After this election, gorilla gets 33% of the vote and leopard gets 34%, making her the winner. Owl, as did turtle and snake before her, drops out of the race. In the last election we'll look at, monkey and tiger voters are unhappy. They both really like the candidates they have supported, but they now have to compromise. Monkey voters agree with gorilla on few issues, but they really don't like leopard. And tiger voters agree with leopard on some issues, but they really don't like gorilla. They strategically abandon their preferred candidate out of fear of the one they disagree with the most becoming king. The final results are leopard 49% and gorilla 51%, with him being crowned the king. Monkey and tiger are the last candidates to drop out, and now the animal kingdom is left with the two-party system. Because of the centrist and swayable owl voters, in future elections, leopard might take the crown, then gorilla wins it back, only to lose it to leopard again, but the two parties never change. The citizens of Animal Kingdom ended up with the system, not because they are lazy voters or because that's what they really wanted, but because the mathematics of how the system is set up. Inevitably, given enough time, all first-past-the-post systems trend towards 2 main parties. But the choices of the voters still hasn't changed since that first election. Only 2/5 of them wanted either leopard or gorilla as their first choice, and 3/5 of them wanted someone else as their first choice. It's this majority of the voters that becomes disinterested in the democratic process because they feel they have no meaningful way to express their real preferences. But it only gets worse from here. If the citizens of Animal Kingdom are divided into groups before they vote, they are susceptible to gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is a bit tricky, but imagine a block of 10 homes each with 1 voter inside. 3 are leopard voters, 3 are gorilla voters, and 4 are owl voters. If they're divided up into groups before they vote, whoever decides where the lines are drawn has enormous influence over who wins the election. For example, if you group the 3 leopard voters with the 2 owl voters, and do the same with the 3 gorilla voters, you can eliminate owl from the election, even though owl voters have the largest minority and would win under a straight first-past-the-post vote. If the leopard or gorilla parties are in charge when the voting boundaries are drawn, they have enormous incentive to carve out safe seats for themselves. But more on gerrymandering in another video. Bah, I hear you say, vote third party and change the system. This brings us to the final and possibly worst problem of first past the post, the spoiler effect. Imagine now that it's been years and years of gorilla or leopard rule. Tiger decides it's time to enter the race. He thinks that the voters are tired of the status quo and he has a shot at winning. He sets up his campaign office, gets a surprising amount of gold and donations, and gets on the Animal News Network to debate with the main candidates. Election night comes around, but alas, Tiger gets only 15% of the vote, mostly from Leopard voters who are closest to him on the political spectrum. Gorilla easily beats Leopard and gets to be king. This is the first-past-the-post system at its worst. The better a third-party candidate does, the more it hurts its own voters by guaranteeing a loss for the party they most agree with and a win for the party they most disagree with. And don't forget, Gorilla is no fool. He knows how the system works. Where do you think some of those gold donations came from? Meanwhile, the Queen Lioness is displeased. She's been observing the elections and sees that the system is bad for her subjects. And she's been thinking, what makes a good voting system? Well, you should be able to vote for the candidate who you like the most without worrying. More choice in representatives is better. The system shouldn't be susceptible to gerrymandering, and it should be open to new political parties. Luckily for the Queen, there are several different voting systems to choose from, including the alternative vote, but that will have to be discussed in detail at another time. Thank you very much for watching.
So the question is then, when does it matter? When does it matter when you have first past the post versus some sort of proportional representation system? And the answer is that it always sort of matters, right? And so it matters particularly if there is a history of disenfranchisement in your country. And so if you're transitioning to a democracy, most of the time we don't recommend, so international observers, international workers don't recommend that newly democratizing countries become presidential systems. Instead, we recommend a parliamentary system that uses proportional representation. And there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that proportional representation obviously ensures that there's some representation for opposition parties that are in the legislature, and that is a good thing because it means that they can have a way to play the game, a way to stay inside the system, and to make changes within the system instead of going outside the system and destroying the democratic process. The second reason that we recommend a parliamentary system instead of a presidential system is because presidential systems tend to rely more on charisma, and so you have presidents that talk directly to the American people instead of to the legislature, where you have power that's diffused across lots of different parties. And so charismatic leaders tend to be more likely to be extra democratic or to go around the democratic system, and that happens more often in presidential systems. We also recommend it in places where there are strong religious, ethnic, or geographical cleavages. And so if you have, so one of the things that we do in the United States is we build some sort of proportional representation system into the Senate. And so we make sure that no matter what, each state has 2 senators that represent them, right? And so that's the way that we ensure geographic equity. But if you had geographical concentration in terms of political parties, you see this in the United Kingdom, where you have not only representatives from different political parties, which are predominantly the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, but you also have representation of interests based on parties that represent Northern Ireland, parties that represent Scotland. And so here we recommend proportional representation because it makes sure that religious parties have strong representation, which means that you don't tend to go outside the system for that. Ethnic parties, and so you don't tend to have some sort of racial caste or apartheid system put into place, and geographic representation, which tends to make sure that you don't have separatist movements. And then it also matters in terms of protecting the rights of small parties as well. So today we've talked about how you define developed democracies. What are the primary definitions and characteristics of developed democracies? How institutions differ across cases, and so the difference between proportional representation and first past the post, the difference between parliamentary systems and presidential systems. We've talked about some of the comparative advantages of these different types of systems as well. Thank you very much for listening.